This? Oh, yeah, I did. It fits my voice very well, so it is. I love Willie and Waylon, and mainly Waylon. All right, very good evening to everybody. We are in this class on Wednesday nights. We're in the book of Exodus. So if you want to open your Bibles to Exodus chapter 23, we're going to pick up where we left off this past week in continuation of Exodus chapter 3. We're working our way through this book, and we are kind of tracking along with our students that are studying this, and last the leaders. They're obviously doing it in a little bit different format than what we are. Fortunately, we don't have tests or Bible bowls or anything like that we have to prepare for, so we just get to take the information and hopefully apply it to our lives. And that's what we hope to do every time in these type of Bible classes, is to take God's Word, even in the Old Testament, and apply it to our lives. Romans chapter 15, verse 4 is a verse that I quote quite often in regards to the Old Testament learning. And I want to read it here for you. For whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. And especially that point, whatever things were written before. Now that does include the New Testament here, but Paul is referring to the Old Testament. And Paul is interesting because he's quite rather an expert on the Old Testament because of all his study and things like that. And he can take the Old Testament and apply it to New Testament truth and really help a Christian, especially a Jewish Christian, come to understand what it means to be a part of the kingdom of God. Well, in this case, we have, in the book of Exodus, we have God teaching His new people, His people that He has promised through Abraham, to Abraham, that would make a great nation. They are now a great nation. We're talking several million people. And they are now, as we've been tracking through Exodus, they are now at the foot of Mount Sinai, where we have that famous scene. Some of you might remember the Charlton Heston. Did I say that right? Charles, what's his name? Got it right the first time. How about that? The old filing cabinet still works. Charlton Heston and the Ten Commandments that he had thrown them down and things like that. And that's kind of the scene where we're at. And we're heading that direction because as we move through these chapters, we're going to get to that part of the golden calf. So what we have here is God has given the Ten Commandments, and then He starts to give more detailed laws. And what is some of the lessons that we've learned from these that apply to us as far as God's nature? Do you remember any of the things that you may have taken away from the last few weeks in regards to God's nature and the things that we're reading about here in these precepts? Our current legal system is based on a lot of this. That's exactly right. What else? God cares about everyone. Not just the rich, not just the more powerful, but even the slaves, the oppressed, everyone. And you see that He even cares about people who are not part of His nation, His holy people. Anything else? Yes, Joe? Yes, God keeps His promises, absolutely. And He will bless you or He will punish you. You can count on it. So good, you've taken away a few things from this, and that's exactly what I want you to see and what God wants you to see. And going back to Romans 15:4, why we have this. So please don't ever look at Exodus when you get to this section as just a bunch of mundane verses about some laws given to an ancient people. No, we are God's holy nation, His people, and a lot of this is basically the foundation of the Christian system as well. Okay, so we are in verse 20, beginning in verse 20 of chapter 23, and what we're about to get into now is what I like to call the promises of the law. We've been talking for the last couple of chapters about the precepts of the law, and that being all these different laws and different judgments and things like that regarding criminal law, laws of possession and restitution and all kinds of things like that. But now we're going to get into something that's a little bit different in regards to the promises of the law. So beginning in verse 20, he says, "Behold, I send an angel before you to keep you in the way and to bring you into the place which I have prepared. Beware of him and obey his voice. Do not provoke him, for he will not pardon your transgressions, for my name is in him." Now, when I was doing my study and trying to understand this passage, when he says that he's going to send an angel. Now, in the New King James, in the version I have, that word is capitalized, as well as the words "beware of him" capitalized. Does anybody else have that in your version? Okay, this is the New King James. Do you have a different version where it doesn't have that? Okay. Okay. So, see, it depends. So it's interesting how different translators will take a word and capitalize it. Now, the question becomes, well, who is this angel that he's talking about? "I will send an angel before you to keep you in the way. Beware of him." And then the main thing that he says, "For my name is in him." If you read the commentaries that are out there, they have all kinds of ideas, but basically this can be accomplished in a few different ways or have some implication in a few different ways. That being one, well, who's leading the people? Who's going to lead when it gets right down to it? In fact, we have a book by his name. Who's going to lead the people into the promised land? Joshua. Okay, Moses is going to get them there, but then Joshua. So this could even be a human entity, a human agent, I should say. Or another possibility is this a heavenly angel. We see that also in the Bible. But then probably the most likely is God himself, the theophany of Jesus. Now, what's interesting about this is that word angel is the word in Hebrew that simply means a messenger. It's a messenger. It's the same thing that we have in the Greek. In the Greek, we transliterate that word. It's angelos in the Greek, and we just transliterate it to make it sound like an English word, angel. But if you were to actually translate it, it would be messenger. Because whenever a Greek said angelos, he didn't hear, "Oh, angel," and had this view in his mind of wings and things like that. He thought, "Oh, messenger," because that's how it was understood. Same way with the Hebrews when he uses the word malak, which is messenger. So he's going to send his messenger before, but my name is in him. Was God's name in Moses? Yes. Was his name in Joshua? Yeah, read Joshua chapter 1, you'll see it. So see how there's different applications you can put to this. And then God himself will go before, and he will do things that no man can do with those enemies of the people. Yes, John. Yeah. Malachi, the prophet, comes from the word malak, which is the word for angel. Very good, yeah. Yes. Okay, then hold up your question then. Okay. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. It is the same. No, not two separate angels. It is the same angel. Okay, so 22, and then we're going to get to 23 as well and continue with your thought because that's a good thought. Verse 22 is, to me, a golden verse. There are golden verses in the Bible, and almost every one of them, especially in the Old Testament and especially in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, these golden verses, they almost always contain this very heavy word. One of the weightiest words in all of English. I don't know what it is in Hebrew, but there is one word right here that has a lot of weight. Can you guess what word that is? How about the word if? A little tiny word, if. What does that imply? It's conditional. It means there's a possibility that you will not do it or that you will do it. If. So it's all conditional. It's contingent upon whether or not you obey. So if you indeed obey. So obedience means that you decided to do it. If you don't obey, it means you didn't. And that's why the word if is there. And you're going to see that over and over and over in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament. The word if you do this, it is conditional. His voice, if you obey his voice and do all that I speak, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. For my angel, now what was noted here, what Angela was noting, was that it went from an angel, beware of him, to now saying my angel. And so this is why we have this question about, well, who is this angel? Is it God or is it Moses or who is it? And it still kind of all still works the same. You talk about concepts and generalities of what God is saying. Is this going to happen? Absolutely. How's he going to accomplish it? He's going to accomplish it through human agency and through divine agency. Does that make sense? Okay. For my angel will go before you and bring you into the Amorites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Canaanites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, and I will cut them off. Now he gets into some precepts and some laws. You shall not bow down to their gods. Remember what I've said a few times in this class already, that all of these laws kind of fit underneath the umbrella of the Ten Commandments. Right? What is the first and second commandment of the Ten Commandments? Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Don't make any carved images. So here it is again. He's just repeating what he's already said in the Ten Commandments. You shall not bow down to their gods, nor serve them, nor do according to their works, but you shall, and this is very, very important. Pay close attention to this. Put a big star. And if you want to, you can make it a falling star because they fail at this. You shall utterly overthrow them and completely break down their sacred pillars. Now, if somebody says, I want you to utterly destroy them, I want you to utterly overthrow them, what does that mean? What's that? Completely. There's nothing left. There's no question. There is no other outcome. It is completely done. Complete would be complete. Unfortunately, it does involve women and children. Now, we're going to see that this was a problem for them. I'll show you some verses here in a few moments. So, you shall serve the Lord your God, and he will bless your bread and your water. And I will take sickness away from the midst of you. No one shall suffer miscarriage or be barren in your land. I will fulfill the number of your days. What a beautiful promise. Go back up to the verse 22. If, conditional, if you obey, not only is he going to go before you and take care of your enemies, but look at all the blessings you're going to get. I think that's what Joe said a minute ago. He keeps his promises both with blessings and also with the curses that come with it. In this case, he says that he will take sickness away. Sign me up. You know, I think a lot of people in this room would be happy with that, wouldn't you? If you obey. And then he says, you will not suffer miscarriage or be barren in your land. He will fulfill the number of your days. Basically what he's saying is you will live a long, prosperous life. That's a wonderful, beautiful promise. And I will send my fear before you, and I will cause confusion among all the people to whom you come, and will make all your enemies turn their backs to you. Now, remember what we started off talking about with this angel. Okay, there's lots of things at play here. I want you to keep your finger right here, but I want you to flip over to Joshua chapter 2. Go ahead and flip over to Joshua chapter 2. We're going to jump up in the story here a little bit. So here he's promising them that I'm going to bring you to this land. And in the meanwhile, I'm going to take good care of you. And I'm going to go before you, and you're going to throw all these people out of this land. And we'll talk about why he's doing that in just a moment. But now let's go forward in the story. Let's fast forward several years, and you get into chapter 2. And this is the story of Rahab and the spies. Do you remember that story? The spies that went in. So Joshua sends the spies to basically do a reconnoiter or reconnaissance to find out what's going on and see what's happening so that they can make a plan. And they come across this harlot, and her name is Rahab. And I want you to notice what she says in verse 9. She says, and said to the men, this is her saying this, I know that the Lord has given you the land, that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. So let's go back now to Exodus, verse 27. I will send my fear before you. Now, how did Rahab have that fear? How did those people in Jericho have that fear? See what he's talking about here? There's lots of different things that are taking place in what's happening here. And that's a good example of what he keeps his promises, just like Joe was saying. He keeps his promises. I will send hornets before you, which will drive out the Hivite and the Canaanite and the Hittite from before you. Now, these hornets may be actual hornets. Could God do that? He kind of demonstrated that he has that kind of power back in Egypt, didn't he? But it may also be the fact that if you look at history, that Egypt spent a lot of time going up and raiding the Canaanites. In fact, we have these different tablets and different historical records from that day and age that helps us trace the history and see even the conquest of Canaan. So it's interesting that the history even goes along with that or follows that. I will not drive them out from before you in 1 year. So he just says, I will drive them out. You need to utterly destroy them. I will send my fear before you, but I will not drive them out from before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the beasts of the field become too numerous. So basically, what he's saying is that they're not really prepared to receive so much so quickly. Have you ever done that with maybe your children or something like that, that you have a lot of gifts to give them or something? You just give them all to them at once? Or sometimes you give them to them a little bit at a time. Sometimes you even build upon those gifts. Well, if you do, here's this, and then if you get that down, we'll give you the next part of the gift and the next part of the gift. God's kind of doing that with his own people. It's like it's too much for you to handle right off the bat. So we're not going to do this. He says, basically, I will not drive them out from before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate. So they would neglect it, working on driving these people out. Little by little, I will drive them out from before you until you have increased and you inherit the land. So it's going to be a gradual process. You know, when we think about the conquest of Canaan, at least I do, when I hear the preachers preach and stories told, I see these soldiers running across the river, rah, going in and just taking everybody down, rah, and just keep going, rah, and taking everybody out, right? That's what I see in my head, but that's not what happened. Just back up and look at the story of Ai. That rah turned in run away, right? Because they were getting beat up. And then God goes in, that's a whole other story with Achan and sin in the camp, things like that. But it's little by little. Okay. And I will set, now we get into a different part of the precepts that he's given, these promises of the law. Now he's going to tell you about the boundary. How big is this piece of land going to be? Remember, he's talking to people he just took out of Egypt. It's only been a few days or weeks, and he's brought these people out. He's telling them, okay, we're going to set up a nation, and here are the laws for that nation. And the reason we're doing this, because not only do you have this theocracy, a leader, but you have laws, you need a territory. And the question might naturally be, well, how big is that territory? And that's what we're fixing to get into. Yes, Oscar? I'll add to that, and I have the exact same thought as I read through this, and it's real easy for us with our 2019 glasses to look back at them and be highly critical of them, but we aren't them, and we weren't their culture. We don't know a lot of things that they experienced, but I think the same thing. It's like, how could you disobey or do the things that you did, like Korah's rebellion and things like that later on, when there's this big fiery cloud right there over the tabernacle and you're following, God is right there in your presence. You've seen him strike down Nadab and Abihu just a few weeks earlier. That's the way I look at it. How could you possibly disobey? But it shows human nature. And it also, that is a strong case for our choice, free will. That even in the presence of God, who comes to mind? Satan. You know, Satan was in the presence of God, and look at him now. So, great point. Okay, so how big is this property going to be? He says, and I will set your bounds from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, and from the desert to the river. Now, obviously, if you look at that, you can see what river he's talking about and things like that. For I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. He repeats himself in verse 32. You shall make no covenant with them, nor with their gods. Did Israel keep that? Even in Joshua's time, you see them making a covenant, making a agreement with people. Now, this is a very important verse that I want you to note, and I'm going to add a reference to it. They shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. There are many reasons why God is driving these people out. Now, I have friends and family who are essentially atheists or just don't really believe in God, or they mock the Bible. And one of their arguments is, okay, so you supposedly have this God of love. What kind of God drives people out of their own land? Utterly destroys them, as you mentioned a minute ago. Women and children are included in utterly destroying. How could a loving God do that? All right. Well, first of all, we should never try to think the way God thinks. God's mind is not man's mind. But the Bible gives us the answer. And here's one of them right here. That if you let them live beside you, and for if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you, lest they make you sin against me. Listen, Brother Rick just gave a wonderful devotional about that very thing. He says that your mind can be what was the word you used? Can be altered, or what's the word that Paul uses? That your conscience can become seared. Your conscience becomes seared. Listen, are we as offended by homosexuality as we were 50 years ago? I hate to say it, but we're not. Because it's in our face all the time. And that's exactly what he's saying. If you have these Canaanite gods around you and these Canaanites all the time and all the things that they do, it's going to have an effect on you, and it's going to cause you to sin against me. Keep your finger right here, and I want you to turn to Deuteronomy 9:5. And if you want to, put this verse beside. If you mark in your Bible, put this verse, Deuteronomy 9:5, beside Exodus 23:33, because this is the answer right here of why God did what he did. He didn't do it just for any arbitrary reason or wanted to make his own nation, or that he's self-centered or anything like that. He has a very specific reason, because he is just and holy and pure. He is love. And yet we see in Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 5. Here's the reason why these people are being driven out. He makes sure that Israel knows it is not because of your righteousness or your uprightness of heart that you go in to possess the land. I am not giving you this land just because you're my people. I am not doing this because you're so wonderful, or you're so great, or you're so big, or you're so mighty. You're not, putting words here, you're none of those things. I, God, this is God speaking, I do this because, he says, but because of the wickedness of these nations, that the Lord your God drives them out from before you, that he may fulfill the word which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All the way back in the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God already had a plan, really before that. But he had a plan, and their wickedness was coming up before him. Does God's patience have a limit? One word, the flood. Two words, the flood. The flood. God's patience has a limit. And so here this wickedness is rising up before him as in days of Noah, but he promised Noah he wouldn't destroy the earth like he did before, so now he's just going to wipe out this one area. Did I hear a question? Yes, and we see it over and over. In fact, that's one of the things about the time of the judges. By the time you get just to the 350 years, not even that long, 100 or so years, 150 years after this approximately, in the time of the judges, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And then it just continues. Then they wanted their own king. And all of this is exactly what God said. And I think it's interesting that God never says, he says, if this happens, he says when. In Deuteronomy, I believe in chapter 6, he says, when you disobey, or when you do this. He knew they would do it. But still, he says here, going back to Exodus, this is the reason why. Now, let's do a couple of, yes. What was the verse? Psalm 106, 36. Yes, John? That's right. Yes. God created everything. It is His land. It is He's the one who gave it to the Jebusites and the Canaanites and the termites and all that other stuff. So. And they were His creation too. And did God care about those people? Absolutely cared about those people. Yes, Scott. There you go.
Rahab herself, we're all afraid because you're coming in. They could have run away.
And Rahab was assimilated into, so which shows that she submitted to God. So could those Canaanites repent and submit? Absolutely. But they still weren't to make any kind of covenant or let them be affected. That's why they had to utterly, notice he says utterly destroy the people, but also the idols in all their worship places. And that was one of the biggest snares to Israel. Now, there's a few things I want to point out in this latter part of the chapter we just read, and that is, when I said that it is the promises of the law, in a nutshell, what he's saying is you need to be faithful in the journey. He's saying be faithful in the journey. Okay, I've given you these laws, and the point of all of this is to lead you to this promised land, to fulfill my promise to your fathers. There's a bigger plan that they don't know about, that he's going to reveal more and more and more about the Messiah. But at this point, he's saying, be faithful in the journey. Okay, I'm going to go with you. I will be with you. Be faithful in the journey. Now, there's a lot of applications that we can use as Christians in this. And one of the first things that comes to mind, when you read about this, what does he call them? He says, I will be an enemy to your enemies. Now, what does Jesus say about our enemies? What was that? Love them. That's exactly right. Matthew chapter 5, verse 48. You shall love your enemies. You also consider that we're also supposed to pray for our enemies. Matthew chapter 5, verse 44. We are to try to reconcile with our enemies. Matthew 5, 23. Now, one of the things that we need to understand is that God will ultimately deal with them, but vengeance is not ours. So, what does that tell us? That Christians can have enemies. Christians can be faithful Christians and yet have enemies. Same thing we're seeing right here. You can be faithful to God. The Israelites can be faithful to God, yet there are enemies out there. So think about it today. Are there enemies that hate Christians? It didn't take long to answer that question. Some of them want to cut our heads off, either verbally or physically with a sword. And so, yes, that's one of the things we learned is be faithful in the journey, but if we put our trust and allow God to provide for us, then we can overcome. He will overcome for us. He will go out for us. And I don't know about you, what your experience is, but I've had my share. I think everybody in the room has had their share of enemies. And it's true. You pray for your enemy, you try to reconcile, and it seems like things work out. They may not be your friend. They may continue to be your enemy, but at least you heap kindness, heap good on their head, coals of goodness on their head. Coals of fire. Well, I was trying to make it a little nicer than that. But any questions, comments about this chapter? That is a concept that is so hard for man to understand. God created us. He can do whatever He wants with us. You realize that God can take the planet Earth and say, I have had enough. And that's it. You know, God can do that. We need to understand that. Ecclesiastes 12, verse 13. Let's hear the conclusion of the matter. Fear God, keep His commandments, for this is the whole of man. This is what you're created for, is to glorify Him. And again, coming back to this, we have free will to do that because God doesn't want robots. That's right. That's exactly right. There's a phrase that's quite simple, is garbage in, garbage out. You surround yourself with influences, and that's what it boils down to, is influence. That influence can come from the television, it can come from the internet, it can come from books, but it especially comes from acquaintances that may have evil in their hearts or something like that. Why? Because those are the people that convince you. You know, the other times you're convincing yourself, but they will give you arguments and things like that, and you know, that phrase peer pressure and things like that. We would like to think that, oh, we're above that. We're not in 5th grade anymore, but no, it's still there. It is still there. Another thing, too, I want to draw out of this is, where is God leading His people? What's the promise? Where is He leading them? The land of milk and honey. The promised land. You see an application for us in there, of course, a parallel for us in that. God is leading us to a promised land. So to them, it was a physical land, and that's the thing you see all the time, is this type and antitype, this type and shadow. Here you see this over and over, especially in Exodus, which again is why it's great to study these things, because you can see Christianity more vividly lived out in the lives of these people from days before. So that's chapter 23. Now, chapter 24, we don't have time to get too deep into it, but I do want to just set it up for next week, because we are going to go through this pretty quick, and then we're going to get into chapter 25, which is the building of the tabernacle. And we're not going to go verse by verse by verse like we did these last couple of weeks, because we're going to instead look at the elements of the tabernacle and get on into some other things like the consecration of the priests, and then the rebellion of the people, and then the ratification again of the covenant. Now here, this is interesting. This particular chapter has the title of it in my Bible called the Covenant ratified. The word ratify means to make a formal consent. And so basically what it is, it's an agreement. And that's what's going to happen here. And it is God essentially saying, okay, here's all the laws and all the rules. Let me back up a little bit. So I take you out of Egypt, I rescue you, and I bring you here, and I want to make you my people. Good? And everybody's like, yes, great idea. He said, okay, well, you need rules. You need laws. You can't just be this new nation or anything without rules or laws. So he lays out all these laws and rules to them, and that's where we get to this chapter. He's like, so now that you know what I'm expecting of you, are you still going to obey me? That's kind of the setup for this chapter. When we talk about ratifying the covenant, is he's essentially saying, now that you know the rules, now that you know what I expect of you, do you want to continue this path? And so what we're going to see is Moses goes through this process, 7 different events that we see of Moses helping the people get ready for this. Now, he said to Moses, come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship from afar. We've already seen Moses go up and get the 10 commandments, and now here he's saying, come on up, and Moses alone shall come near the Lord, but they shall not come near, nor shall their people go up with him. So there's a kind of a separation here. You have all the people, and now God is saying, come up the mountain, Moses and Aaron and the sons and the leaders, and come on up the mountain, but only Moses comes all the way up. So it's kind of like you have Moses going up to God, you have these leaders in the middle, and then the people down below. And that's actually what's going to wind up happening when he sets up the priesthood. It's going to be these that are going to minister, because every one of them that goes are these that are going to wind up in the priesthood, except for the judges who are representative of the tribes. Yes, Rick? What a great point. So, applying that to Christianity, you need to, as Jesus says, count the cost. You need to look at what's involved in that, and that's such a great point, because otherwise you just wind up getting people wet. We see that in the mission field. That's happened with even within the Church of Christ. If you don't properly set them up, properly teach them and show them why they're doing what they're doing, then they're just getting wet. Now, somebody could get wet and still become a Christian, but because hopefully they did it for the right reasons. But they need to count the cost. And so many times, I'm sure Scott and Rebecca have seen this too. So many times we thought we really did that well, and then they fall away. In fact, there was kind of a phenomenon in Paraguay. We called it the 1-year beast, because it seemed like right at the 1-year mark of their baptism, their anniversary of their baptism, it's like the beast came and got them or something, because it's like we didn't know how to counteract that or something. So, and we have the problem here. We have the same problem here in the States. Any other last comments, questions, concerns? Yes, John? Yes, sir? That's right. If you obey me, I'll take care of you. John 14:15, Jesus says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. Did I see another hand up over here? Okay. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope you have a great rest of your week. God bless you.